Specialist Keaton Briggs had been loading trucks since 0430, and by the time the sun cracked the ridgeline above Fort Cavern's motor pool, he figured he knew every face that belonged there. He knew the grease-stained sergeants who walked the line checking lug nuts. He knew the fuel handlers, the comms techs, the dispatch runners in their reflective vests. He did not know the woman in the tan undershirt kneeling at the rear axle of Truck 4. She was young, late 20s at most, with close-cropped hair, and the kind of stillness that came from not needing to prove anything to anyone, watching. She pressed a thumb against the valve stem, listened, moved on to the next. No patches on her chest, no rank visible, no conversation. Briggs assumed she was a civilian contractor running a last-minute tire check and thought nothing else about her. He had his own work. The convoy had 11 vehicles and a 12-hour window, and he was still 3 pallets short on the manifest. Captain Delwood arrived at 0510. Briggs had served under 3 captains in 2 years, and he recognized the type the moment Delwood stepped through the chain-link gate. Chest. Forward, clipboard tucked like a sidearm, eyes moving across the motor pool, the way an officer's eyes move when they are looking for something to correct. Delwood's logistics oversight, a staff assignment, not a field man. He had a staff man's hands, clean, uncalloused, the grip of someone who handled paper and not equipment. But the convoy brief was his to run, and he ran it like a man who had never once sat in the lead vehicle on a live route. He stopped in front of Truck 4. The woman was standing now, both hands on the side mirror, running through a pre-departure check on the door seals. She worked without looking up, moving from the mirror to the latch to the window seal, and back with the methodical rhythm of someone who has done the same check so many times that it lives in the hands rather than the mind. Delwood looked at her for a moment, and then he looked at her forearm. There were marks on it. A column of short horizontal lines scored in fading grease pencil, grouped in clusters of 5. They ran from just above the wrist nearly to the crook of the elbow. Anyone who had ever kept score of anything would recognize the shape of a tally. Briggs had noticed them too, earlier, and thought she must be tracking something mechanical, tire rotations maybe, or fluid cycles. He had not asked. Delwood did not think any of those things. What are those? He asked. His voice carried the deliberate volume of a man performing for a room. The other drivers looked up. A fuel handler paused mid-cap. The motor pool went quiet the way a room goes quiet when someone in authority points at something they intend to make an example of. A prison count? She turned from the mirror. She looked at it the way a person looks at something they have already decided is not worth their energy. Not with contempt, just with a kind of patient removal the way a seasoned surgeon might regard a stuck drawer. Motor pool hand? Delwood continued, looking at her unmarked chest and then at the clipboard in his own hand. He found her name, though Briggs could not see which line. You're not on this convoy manifest. Why are you running a check on Truck 4? Route familiarization, she said. 2 words, flat and clear. Delwood's jaw shifted. Route familiarization is done by assigned convoy personnel. You're not assigned. He closed the clipboard with the snap of a man who considers that sound a period. Step back from the vehicle. She did. Without argument, without a word, she stepped back from Truck 4 and folded her hands at her sides. The grease pencil tally on her forearm caught the early light, and Delwood gave it one more look. The look of a man who had found the thing he wanted to mock, and had mocked it sufficiently, and turned to the rest of the motor pool. Let's run the brief, he said. Briggs kept loading. He told himself it didn't matter. She was a contractor. Or she was reassigned and hadn't gotten word yet. Or the captain had a reason Briggs wasn't privy to. He told himself this and loaded the last of the supply pallets, and thought about Route 9, which was 61 kilometers of hardpack and switchback through the Cavern Desert Corridor, 2 passes that narrowed to a single lane, a set of valley floor culverts the intelligence briefs had flagged 3 times in the past month, and a long stretch of featureless hardpack where the heat came off the ground in waves by mid-morning and made the far end of any straightaway look like water. He thought about the culverts when they hit trouble at the 40-kilometer mark. It wasn't an ambush in the textbook sense. It was a blown drainage crossing, structural failure on the main culvert, or something placed inside it, and the lead vehicle's front axle punched through the deck at speed and stopped hard. The convoy halted. The radio traffic started. 2 vehicles canted at bad angles, the route forward impassable, and Delwood was on the net with dispatch pulling for a bypass while the drivers sat in their cabs and watched the ridgeline and the dust settled around the canted trucks. There was no fire, but there was no forward movement either, and 61 kilometers of corridor with 1 road in and 1 road out leaves a stationary convoy with very few good options. Back at Fort Cavern, Sergeant Major Tyne had been in dispatch since 0600. He was a hard man, 43 years of service, compressed into a frame that never quite relaxed, and when the net lit up with the Route 9 contact report, he moved to the terminal with the efficiency of someone who had handled worse. He needed a route alternate called quickly, by someone who knew this ground well enough to run the bypass on voice. Without maps, without real-time imagery, from memory alone, he typed her name into the duty log. The terminal returned her record, and Sergeant Major Tyne stopped. He was not a man who stopped easily. He had stood in front of general officers and delivered bad news without flinching. He had read casualty reports on routes he had cleared himself and filed them without visible effect. But he sat with her record on the screen for a long moment, reading, scrolling, reading again. 31 convoy routes on the cavern corridor, 31 extractions, 0 chaos, not across a good stretch, not for a single rotation, across all 31 runs. The record had been sealed after the 14th, reclassified after the 22nd, and the notation on the 29th read, convoy lead deviated from approved route on her own authority, called alternate bypass via voice from memory, extracted all personnel under contact. Deviation credited with preventing an estimated total loss event. The seal on the file was signed by a Brigadier General Tyne recognized from his third deployment. He picked up the phone and called Colonel Marsh. It was 0742 when the colonel's vehicle pulled into the motor pool. Briggs had heard nothing. The convoy was still holding on Route 9, waiting on a bypass call that hadn't come, and the motor pool was half empty and quiet in the way that forward posts go quiet when something has gone sideways and no one is sure yet what it costs. He was running inventory on the residual load when Colonel Marsh came through the gate on foot, which Marsh almost never did. The colonel was a deliberate man, the kind of officer who did not move fast unless the situation required it. He was moving fast now. The woman was sitting on a wheel chock near the east wall, a patrol map spread on her knees, a grease pencil in her hand. She had not left. She had not filed a complaint, not spoken to anyone, not explained herself to the motor pool that had watched Delwood dismiss her. She had simply moved to the east wall and continued working, alone, and Briggs had stopped noticing her an hour ago the way you stop noticing. Something that doesn't demand your attention. Marsh stopped in front of her. He looked at her for one moment, and then he said, quietly enough that Briggs had to stop moving entirely to hear it, driftwood. She looked up from the map. Yes, sir. Marsh nodded once, slowly, like a man confirming something he already knew but needed to hear aloud. He turned to the motor pool at large. His voice changed register, not louder exactly, but harder, with the carrying quality of a voice that has spent decades being the last word in rooms where the last word mattered. Listen up. The fuel handlers stopped. The two remaining drivers looked over. A comms tech in the doorway of the dispatch bay straightened without being told to. Briggs set down his clipboard. The woman on the wheel chock, Marsh said, is First Lieutenant Celia Vance. She holds a sealed record on this corridor that I am going to read to you now, because it should have been on your wall the first day she arrived at this post. He had a single printed sheet. He read from it without preamble, without ceremony, in the flat factual cadence of a man who understood that the facts were ceremony enough. 31 convoy routes, 31 zero casualty extractions, the notation on the 29th, the seal from the Brigadier General, the citation on the 22nd run, still classified, never publicly filed, which named her call sign and credited her route decision with extracting 41 personnel from a collapsing exfil corridor under active contact, on a road that the maps had said did not exist and that she had called from memory. The motor pool was absolutely quiet. Briggs stood with nothing in his hands and did not move. Captain Delwood, Marsh said, and Delwood had come through the gate 60 seconds behind the colonel, having been summoned by the same call, and was standing near the fence now with his clipboard loose at his side, is relieved of convoy authority, effective immediately. He will report to my office at Zovro 900. He paused, just long enough. Lieutenant Vance will take the Route 9 bypass call now. She was already standing. She had the patrol map folded under her arm. Sir! She moved to the dispatch bay without hurrying. Briggs watched Delwood. The captain stood near the gate, and the look on his face was not anger, and it was not defiance. It was the look of a man who had opened a door, expecting a supply closet, and found a corridor that went back further than he could see. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. From the dispatch bay, through the open door, Briggs heard her voice on the net, steady, measured, unhurried, calling out the bypass route by memory. Kilometer marker by kilometer marker, the alternate crossing at the 38th marker, the surface conditions at the 42nd, the load-bearing limit of the northern culvert that the intelligence briefs had missed entirely. She spoke for 4 minutes. The convoy on Route 9 confirmed, moved, and was rolling again before Eero 800. Briggs stood where he was and looked at the wheel chalk where she had spent the morning alone against the east wall, her patrol map across her knees. He thought about the tally marks. 31 of them. He counted them back in his mind, the clusters of 5, the single lines between, the way they ran up her forearm, in clean grease pencil lines. He had thought they were maintenance counts. He had loaded the truck that morning and not given her a second look. Sergeant Major Tyne came out of the dispatch bay and paused beside him and looked at nothing in particular for a moment. Every single one, Tyne said. Briggs did not have to ask what he meant. He understood. Standing in the Fort Cavern motor pool, with the sun now full above the ridgeline and the convoy moving clean on Route 9, that those marks were not a count of routes. They were a count of people brought home. Every line on her forearm was a convoy's worth of soldiers who had crossed 61 kilometers of hardpack through the Cavern Desert corridor and come out the other side because she had known the ground, called the turn, and never once lost one. 31 times. Delwood had asked her if it was a prison count. She had not answered. She had stepped back from the truck and waited for the record to speak, the way she always had, the way a person speaks when they know that every word they will ever need is already written, scored in grease pencil, sealed in a file, confirmed 31 times running. Colonel Marsh's vehicle pulled out of the motor pool at 0810. Briggs watched it go. He thought about what it meant to be certain enough of something that you don't defend it. You just stand beside it, quietly, and let the record arrive. He picked up his clipboard and went back to work, but he looked at the east wall once more before he did. At the wheel chalk, at the place where she had sat with her map and her grease pencil and her 31 marks, and said nothing to anyone. Not one of them lost.